The September wind carried the scent of dying leaves through Riverside Cemetery in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where 4 generations of Kowalskis had been laid to rest before grandfather Stanley. I stood at the graveside, watching my cousin Michael adjust his expensive suit jacket for the 3rd time, while Aunt Patricia dabbed at eyes that hadn't produced actual tears since the will reading 2 days prior. The Methodist minister's words about eternal rest seemed to dissolve into the crisp autumn air, but my mind wasn't on eulogies or eternal peace. In my jacket pocket, folded carefully between the funeral program and my grandfather's worn leather wallet, lay something that made my chest tight with a mixture of anticipation and unease I couldn't quite name. The hand-drawn map had been tucked inside an old ammunition box Stanley had pressed into my hands 3 weeks before his heart finally surrendered to 8 decades of Pennsylvania winters and Lucky Strike cigarettes. "For you, Tommy," he'd whispered in that voice like gravel in a coffee can, "when the time comes. Not for them others." The others were scattered around the grave now like crows picking at roadkill. Michael, my father's nephew, had driven up from Philadelphia in his BMW, already calculating his share of the modest estate. My father, Robert, stood stoically beside my stepmother, Carol, who kept checking her phone with the practiced discretion of someone more comfortable at the mall than at memorial services. Even my half-brother Danny had managed to tear himself away from his cryptocurrency trading long enough to pay respects, though I caught him photographing the floral arrangements, probably for his girlfriend's Instagram account. Stanley Kowalski had been many things during his 78 years on Earth. A machinist at the Bethlehem steel plant for 37 years, a Korean War veteran who never talked about Incheon, a widower who'd raised 3 children after Grandma Rose died of cancer in 1978. But above all, he'd been a man who noticed things, small things, the way people's voices changed when money entered a conversation, the way certain family members only visited during the holidays and only then when they needed something. The map in my pocket felt heavier with each passing moment, though it couldn't have weighed more than a few ounces. Stanley had drawn it himself in his precise machinist's handwriting, complete with compass bearings and landmark references that meant nothing to anyone who hadn't spent summers exploring the woods behind his house. 47 paces northeast from the old oak with the lightning scar, one notation read. 16 paces due west from the stone wall by Miller's Creek. But it wasn't just a treasure map, though that's what it looked like at first glance. There were other notations written in a different ink, as if Stanley had returned to it multiple times over the years, dates going back to 1962. Cryptic references to supply drops and emergency protocols, numbers that looked like coordinates. And at the bottom, in Rose's distinctive handwriting, for Tommy's eyes only, the truth about what Stanley built. As dirt hit Stanley's casket with that final hollow sound that marks the end of a life, I made my decision. Whatever Stanley had built, whatever secret he'd trusted me with, none of them deserved to know about it. Not Michael with his calculating eyes and expensive suits. Not Patricia with her spreadsheet mind and synthetic tears. Not even my own father, who'd spent years waiting for Stanley to die so he could finally cash in on his inheritance. The map would remain my secret, just as Stanley had intended. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from as we uncover the truth about Stanley Kowalski's final gift. The VFW Hall on Maple Street hadn't changed since my childhood visits with Stanley. The same faded photographs of Korean War veterans lined the paneled walls, the same smell of coffee and pine sol hung in the air, and the same mismatched folding chairs surrounded tables covered in red, white, and blue plastic tablecloths. But everything felt different now, filtered through the weight of the secret burning in my pocket. I watched my family navigate the buffet line with the practiced efficiency of people who'd attended too many funerals, their conversations already shifting from Stanley's life to his assets. Patricia was explaining to anyone who'd listen how she'd practically raised Stanley during his final years, conveniently omitting the fact that her visits had been limited to major holidays and medical emergencies. Michael nodded sympathetically while mentally cataloging the antique furniture in Stanley's living room. "Your grandfather was a character," said Harold Kowalski, Stanley's younger brother who'd driven down from Scranton despite his own failing health. At 74, Harold still possessed the same piercing blue eyes that had run in the Kowalski men for generations, though his were now clouded with cataracts and unshed tears. Always building something in that basement of his, Rose used to joke that Stanley loved his workshop more than he loved her. The mention of my grandmother sent a familiar ache through my chest. Rose Kowalski had died when I was 12, but her presence had filled Stanley's house like the scent of her signature pierogi and kielbasa. She'd been the heart of family gatherings, the one who remembered every birthday and anniversary, who could settle any argument with a look and heal any wound with her cooking. After her death, Stanley had retreated into his workshop, emerging only for meals and the occasional family obligation. "What kind of things did he build down there?" I asked Harold, trying to keep my voice casual. The question felt loaded with significance, though I couldn't have explained why to anyone listening. Harold's weathered face creased into a smile. "Oh, you know Stanley, always tinkering. Built your grandmother a spice rack that could have survived a nuclear war. Made toys for you kids that were better than anything you could buy in stores. Remember that treehouse he constructed for you and Danny behind his place?" I did remember. The treehouse had been an architectural marvel for a backyard project, complete with rope ladder, window boxes, and a pulley system for hauling up supplies. Stanley had spent 3 weekends on it, measuring twice and cutting once with the precision that had made him one of Bethlehem Steel's most valued machinists. But more than the craftsmanship, I remembered the way his face had lit up when Danny and I had declared it the best treehouse in Lancaster County. "He never could sit still," Harold continued, spooning potato salad onto his paper plate. "Even during the war, when we was stationed together at Camp Pendleton before shipping out to Korea, Stanley was always fixing something, improving something. The Army loved guys like him, could repair anything with a screwdriver and some wire." Korea. Stanley rarely mentioned his service, despite the Purple Heart and Bronze Star displayed prominently on his mantelpiece. The few stories he'd shared had come late at night, usually after a few beers and only when pressed by curious grandchildren. Tales of frozen ground so hard they'd needed explosives to dig foxholes. Of Chinese forces appearing out of nowhere like ghosts in the snow. Of friends who'd left for patrol one morning and never returned. "He never talked much about what happened over there," I said to Harold, fishing for information that might connect to the mysterious map. Harold's expression darkened, and he glanced around the room before leaning closer. "There's things a man don't talk about, Tommy. Things that change you in ways that don't heal, even after 60 years. Stanley came back different than when he left. We all did. But Stanley, he came back with purposes nobody else understood." The word purposes hung in the air between us like smoke from an extinguished candle. Before I could press Harold for details, Patricia's voice cut across the room like a rusty saw. "Tommy, come settle something for us." She waved me toward a corner table where Michael was holding court with a small group of distant relatives I barely recognized. "Michael says Stanley's house is probably worth more than we thought." I joined the group reluctantly, watching Michael spread what looked like real estate listings across the table. His expensive suit and gold watch seemed out of place among the humble surroundings of the VFW hall. "The lot alone is worth at least $80,000, Michael was explaining with practiced confidence. "It's a full acre, and those old neighborhoods are becoming desirable again. Young families want character homes with big yards." He looked up at me with eyes that calculated rather than grieved. "Of course, the house itself needs work. That electrical system is probably from the 50s. "Stanley kept everything in good repair," I said, surprised by the defensive edge in my voice. "Oh, absolutely," Michael agreed quickly. "But there's a difference between maintaining an old house and bringing it up to modern standards. The kitchen hasn't been updated since the Carter administration, and don't get me started on that basement. It's like a museum down there." The basement. Stanley's domain, where he'd spent countless hours after Rose's death. I'd visited that basement workshop hundreds of times during childhood summers, watching Stanley transform raw materials into useful objects with surgical precision. But something in Michael's dismissive tone made my jaw clench. "The important thing," Patricia added, "is that we handle this as a family. Stanley would have wanted us to work together." The hypocrisy was breathtaking. Patricia had visited Stanley exactly 4 times in the past 2 years, yet here she was, speaking about family unity while calculating her inheritance share. I excused myself and stepped outside, needing air that wasn't thick with false sentiment. The map in my pocket seemed to pulse with possibility. Whatever Stanley had built in those woods, whatever truth Rose had written about, my family didn't deserve to know about it. Not yet. 3 days after the funeral, I found myself standing in Stanley's driveway at 7 in the morning, coffee steaming in the September chill as I stared at the house that had defined my childhood summers. The white clapboard siding needed paint, and the front porch sagged slightly on the left side, but the structure radiated the solid craftsmanship of a different era. Stanley had maintained everything with the methodical precision of a man who understood that neglect compounded like interest on a bad debt. My father had given me the keys with obvious reluctance, along with instructions to assess what needs doing before the family made any decisions about the property. What he didn't know was that I'd already made my decision. I was going to find Stanley's bunker, and I was going to do it alone. The key turned easily in the front door. Stanley had kept the locks oiled and functional right up until his final hospital stay. The house smelled like Old Spice and coffee, with an underlying hint of the lemon oil Rose had used on the furniture decades ago. Everything was exactly as Stanley had left it, from the Korean War photos on the mantelpiece to the crossword puzzle book open on his kitchen table, frozen mid-solution like a stopped clock. I made my way to the basement, where Stanley's workshop waited in perfect order. The pegboard walls still held every tool in its designated place, outlined in black marker with Stanley's precise handwriting identifying each implement. His workbench stretched along the far wall, its surface clean except for a small vise and a coffee can filled with pencils sharpened to needle points. But something felt wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not obviously disturbed, but wrong in the way that only someone who'd spent countless hours in this space would notice. The measuring tape that usually hung beside the drill press was missing. A stack of lumber that had sat in the corner for months was gone. Most telling of all, Stanley's toolbox, a massive red Craftsman chest that had followed him home from Bethlehem Steel when the plant closed, showed signs of recent use despite Stanley being in the hospital for his final 3 weeks. I opened the toolbox drawers methodically, finding gaps where specific tools should have been. A cordless drill, heavy-duty wire cutters, a small sledgehammer Stanley had called his persuader. The pattern suggested someone had borrowed tools for a construction project, but Stanley had been too sick to build anything in his final months. My phone buzzed with a text from Michael. Any thoughts on timeline for cleaning out the house? Patricia's eager to get it on the market before winter. The message irritated me more than it should have. Stanley had been dead less than a week, and already they were treating his home like a commodity to be liquidated. I climbed the stairs to Stanley's bedroom, where everything remained exactly as he'd left it. The bed was made with military precision, hospital corners tight enough to bounce a quarter. His reading glasses sat folded on the nightstand beside a biography of Eisenhower and a glass of water that had long since evaporated to a ring of mineral deposits. But again, something nagged at the edges of my consciousness. The closet door, which Stanley always kept closed, stood slightly ajar. Inside, his clothes hung in perfect order. Work shirts arranged by color, dress pants pressed and creased, his old army uniform in a garment bag at the far end. But the small stepladder that usually stood in the corner was missing. I found it in the hallway closet, along with a cardboard box that hadn't been there during my last visit 3 months ago. The box was unmarked except for Stanley's initials in black marker, and it was surprisingly heavy for its size. Inside, I discovered items that made my pulse quicken. Architectural drawings printed on blue paper, property surveys, and correspondence with various government agencies dating back to 1962. The architectural drawings showed detailed plans for an underground structure, complete with ventilation systems, electrical layouts, and what appeared to be a sophisticated filtration system. The structure was far more complex than anything Stanley could have built alone. It would have required professional expertise, significant resources, and probably official permits. But the correspondence was what made my hands shake as I read. Letters from the Army Corps of Engineers, communications with the Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency, references to civil defense protocols and strategic family shelters, and stamped across several documents in faded red ink, classified, authorized personnel only. Stanley hadn't just built a bunker in those woods. He'd built it with government approval, possibly government assistance, as part of some Cold War civil defense program I'd never heard of. The dates on the documents coincided with the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the threat of nuclear war had felt real enough to justify extraordinary measures. My phone rang, startling me so badly that I nearly dropped the box. The caller ID showed Harold's number. "Tommy, you at Stanley's place?" Harold's voice sounded strained, older than it had at the funeral 3 days ago. "Yeah, I'm going through some of his things. How are you holding up, Uncle Harold?" A long pause. "Listen, son. I've been thinking about our conversation at the VFW. About Stanley and his projects. There's things you need to know, but not over the phone. Can you drive up to Scranton? Today, if possible. The urgency in Harold's voice made my stomach clench. Is everything all right? I don't know, Harold said quietly. But I got a call this morning from someone asking questions about Stanley's property. Someone who knew things they shouldn't know. Things about what he built back in '62. The line went quiet except for Harold's labored breathing. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of secrets kept too long. Bring that map with you, Tommy, and don't tell nobody where you're going. Not your daddy, not Michael, not nobody. There's people who've been waiting a long time for Stanley to die, and they ain't family. The call ended, leaving me alone in Stanley's bedroom with a box full of classified documents and the growing certainty that I'd stumbled into something far more dangerous than family drama over an inheritance. Outside, a car door slammed in the driveway. Through the bedroom window, I watched Michael climb out of his BMW, Patricia emerging from the passenger seat. They were early, too early for a casual visit, and they were looking at Stanley's house with the focused intensity of people searching for something specific. I had perhaps 30 seconds before they knocked on the front door. 30 seconds to hide the box, pocket the map, and pretend I was just the grieving grandson doing his family duty. But as I watched Patricia point toward the basement windows while speaking rapidly to Michael, I realized they weren't here to discuss real estate timelines. They were here because they knew about Stanley's secret, and they wanted it for themselves. I shoved the classified documents back into the box and slid it under Stanley's bed just as the front doorbell chimed through the house. My heart hammered against my ribs as I walked downstairs, forcing my expression into something resembling casual grief rather than the panic that was threatening to overwhelm me. Michael stood on the front porch wearing a different expensive suit than he'd worn to the funeral, this one charcoal gray with a subtle pinstripe that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Patricia flanked him, her smile too bright for 7:30 in the morning, clutching a thermos of coffee like a peace offering. "Tommy, we didn't expect to find you here so early," Patricia said, though her eyes were already scanning the living room behind me with the practiced efficiency of an appraiser. "We brought coffee and thought we'd help you start going through Stanley's things." Help was the last thing I wanted from either of them, especially after Harold's cryptic warning about people who'd been waiting for Stanley to die. But I stepped aside and let them in, watching as Michael immediately gravitated toward Stanley's desk in the corner of the living room. "Dad gave me the keys yesterday," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "Figured I'd get an early start before it gets too overwhelming." "Smart thinking," Michael said, his fingers already rifling through the papers on Stanley's desk with practiced efficiency. "Estate organization is always easier when you tackle it systematically. Mind if I take a look at his filing system? I've got experience with these kinds of situations." The casual way he assumed control of the situation made my jaw clench, but I nodded. While Michael sorted through Stanley's modest paperwork, utility bills, medical correspondence, bank statements, I watched Patricia move through the house with the focused attention of someone conducting a search rather than offering family support. "Stanley certainly was organized," she commented, opening kitchen drawers and peering into cabinets. "Everything has its place, very methodical." She opened the basement door and peered down the wooden steps. "Mind if I take a look at his workshop? I'm curious about what tools might be valuable." "Sure," I said, though every instinct screamed against letting her down there. "Watch the fourth step. It creaks." As Patricia's footsteps echoed from the basement, Michael held up a manila folder filled with what looked like insurance documents. "Tommy, did Stanley ever mention anything unusual about his property? Any special features or improvements that might affect the value?" The question felt loaded, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly why. "Just the usual stuff. He maintained everything well, kept up with repairs." "Why?" Michael's smile was practiced, professional. "Oh, you know how these old properties can be. Sometimes there are surprise features that add value. Old wells, outbuildings, that sort of thing. I'm just trying to get a complete picture for when we have it appraised." Patricia's voice drifted up from the basement. "Tommy, some of these tools are missing from their spots on the pegboard. Do you know if Stanley lent them to anyone?" The observation was too specific, too knowing. Patricia had never shown the slightest interest in Stanley's workshop during her infrequent visits. Her sudden expertise in his organizational system felt calculated. "I noticed that too," I called down. Maybe Harold borrowed something, or one of the neighbors. But even as I said it, I remembered Harold's words about Stanley's purposes and the classified documents hidden upstairs. Whatever Stanley had built in those woods, it was significant enough to attract attention from people who weren't family, and clever enough to inspire family members to suddenly develop interests in property features and missing tools. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Meet me at Miller's Diner on Route 30 at 2 p.m. Come alone. H. Harold was being cautious, using a number I didn't recognize and suggesting a public meeting place. The cloak and dagger approach might have seemed paranoid under normal circumstances, but nothing about this situation felt normal. I should probably head back home soon, I announced. Got some work things to catch up on. Michael looked up from Stanley's papers with sharp attention. Actually, Tommy, I was hoping we could discuss timeline. Patricia and I think it might be more efficient if we handled the estate clearing. You've got your own life in reading, and this is a big job for one person. The offer was reasonable on its surface, but something in Michael's tone made it sound less like help and more like a takeover attempt. I appreciate the offer, but I want to take my time with Stanley's things. Make sure nothing important gets overlooked. Of course, Patricia said, emerging from the basement with dust on her expensive cardigan. We just don't want you to feel burdened. Families should support each other during difficult times. The word family felt hollow coming from someone who'd visited Stanley 4 times in 2 years, but I smiled and nodded, playing the role of grateful nephew while counting the minutes until they left. After they finally departed, Michael with several pages of notes about Stanley's estate assets, and Patricia with suspicious knowledge of his workshop organization, I sat in Stanley's kitchen trying to piece together what was happening. The morning had confirmed my growing suspicions. My family's sudden interest in Stanley's property wasn't motivated by grief or even ordinary greed. They knew something, maybe not everything, but enough to make them search for missing tools and ask pointed questions about property features. The question was how much they knew and how they'd learned it. I spent the next hour methodically searching Stanley's house for anything else that might connect to the mysterious bunker. In his bedroom closet behind a row of work shirts, I found a small fireproof safe I'd never noticed before. The combination lock looked recent, and after trying Stanley's birthday, Rose's birthday, and their wedding anniversary without success, I finally tried the date of the Korean War armistice, 7/27/53. The safe opened with a satisfying click, revealing contents that made my pulse quicken. More architectural drawings, these showing electrical and plumbing systems for the underground structure. A folder labeled Emergency Protocols, containing lists of supplies, water purification tablets, and something called Radiation Detection Equipment. And most unsettling, a recent letter dated just 6 weeks before Stanley's death. The letter was from someone named Colonel James Morrison, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, retired. The letterhead showed a Washington, D.C. address, and the tone was formal but urgent. Stanley, as discussed during our phone conversation, recent developments have made it necessary to secure certain Cold War installations that remain classified. The family shelter program ended officially in 1968, but several installations remain functional and must be properly decommissioned. Your cooperation in this matter would be appreciated and appropriately compensated. The letter was signed in blue ink, with a phone number handwritten at the bottom. I stared at the letter until the words blurred. Stanley hadn't just built a Cold War bunker. He'd built it as part of a government program that apparently still existed, at least unofficially. And 6 weeks before his death, someone in Washington had contacted him about securing the installation. Had Stanley refused? Was that why Colonel Morrison was now interested in the property? And how had my family learned about any of this? My phone alarm chimed, reminding me about my meeting with Harold. As I gathered the documents and locked them back in the safe, I noticed one final detail that made my blood run cold. The combination I'd used to open the safe, 7/27/53, was written in pencil on the back of the map Stanley had given me, so faintly I'd missed it during my initial examination. Stanley had wanted me to find these documents. He'd left me breadcrumbs to follow, a trail that led from the map to the safe to the classified documents to whatever was waiting in those woods. But he'd also left me something else. The growing certainty that I wasn't the only one following this trail. Miller's Diner hadn't changed since the Eisenhower administration, from its red vinyl booths to the rotating pie case that had been displaying the same 3 varieties since I was a child. Harold sat in the back corner booth, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had seen too many refills. When he looked up at me, his blue eyes carried the weight of secrets that had been festering for 60 years. "You found the safe," he said before I'd even sat down. It wasn't a question. I slid into the booth across from him, noting how Harold's gaze swept the diner's other customers with practiced vigilance. "How did you know?" "Because you got that same look Stanley had after he talked to that colonel fellow." Harold's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Like a man who just realized he's been walking on thin ice his whole life and somebody just turned up the heat. The waitress approached with a coffee pot, but Harold waved her away with the kind of authority that suggested this conversation required complete privacy. When she retreated, he leaned forward across the table. "Stanley called me 3 days before he died," Harold said. "Hospital bed, tubes running everywhere, but his mind was sharp as ever. He told me about that colonel, about the pressure they was putting on him to cooperate with some decommissioning program." Harold's fingers made air quotes around the word cooperate, his expression suggesting it had carried more threat than invitation. "What exactly did Stanley build out there, Uncle Harold?" Harold was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his words came slow and measured, like a man confessing sins he'd carried too long. "It was 1962, right after the Cuban thing. Government was scared, Tommy, really scared. They had this program, called it the Family Shelter Initiative, where they'd help certain folks build private bunkers on their own land. Folks with the right skills, the right location, the right discretion." He paused to sip his coffee, though his hands shook slightly as he lifted the cup. "Stanley was perfect for them. Military training, machinist skills, property in the middle of nowhere, and a mouth that stayed shut when it needed to. They provided the plans, some of the materials, even technical support. In exchange, Stanley built something that could keep a family alive for months if the Soviets decided to turn Pennsylvania into a parking lot. The pieces were starting to fit together, but the picture they formed made me increasingly uneasy." "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because the program never really ended," Harold said, his voice carrying a tremor I'd never heard before. "It just went underground, if you'll pardon the expression. Stanley told me they've been checking on those old installations for years, making sure they stay secure. Most of the original builders are dead now, but Stanley—" Harold shook his head. "Stanley was stubborn. When they came around suggesting he should let them decommission his bunker, he told them where they could stick their suggestions." A chill ran down my spine as I remembered the letter from Colonel Morrison. "What happens to bunkers that don't get decommissioned?" Harold's expression darkened. "Nothing good, according to Stanley. He thought they wanted to strip out equipment that was still classified, maybe even use the installation for purposes that wasn't so different from what it was originally built for." He leaned closer. "Stanley also thought someone in your family had been asking the wrong questions to the wrong people." The words hit me like ice water. "What do you mean?" "Your cousin Michael's been doing real estate research on Stanley's property for months, Tommy. Not just casual browsing, detailed surveys, soil composition studies, utility access reports. The kind of research you do when you're planning something specific." Harold's voice carried the weight of a man who'd been piecing together an unwelcome puzzle. "Patricia's been asking neighbors about Stanley's routines, his health, when he might need to move to assisted living." My hands clenched involuntarily around my coffee cup. "You think they know about the bunker?" "I think they know enough to be dangerous," Harold said. "And I think that colonel fellow knows they know." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded newspaper clipping. This ran in the Philadelphia Inquirer 3 weeks ago, buried on page 6. The headline read, "Defense Department begins classified Cold War site recovery program." The article was brief, mentioning efforts to secure decommissioned installations that may contain sensitive materials and the need for voluntary cooperation from private property owners. But it was the final paragraph that made my blood run cold. The program has identified several dozen sites in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia where cooperation has proven challenging. Department officials declined to comment on specific enforcement measures. "Stanley saw this article," Harold continued, "called me that same day, scared in a way I hadn't heard since Korea. He said they'd been pressuring him for months, making offers that sounded generous but felt like threats. And then your family started sniffing around his property with too much interest and too much knowledge. The diner suddenly felt too small, too exposed. I found myself scanning the other customers the way Harold had been doing, wondering who might be watching, who might be listening. "What did Stanley want me to do with the map?" I asked. Harold's smile was grim. Same thing he would have done if someone had tried to take his foxhole in Korea, defend what's his. He reached across the table and gripped my wrist with surprising strength. "That bunker contains things the government don't want falling into the wrong hands, Tommy. But it also contains things Stanley didn't want the government getting back." "What kind of things?" "The kind that prove certain programs never ended, just changed names and went deeper underground." Harold's eyes held mine with an intensity that made me lean forward despite my fear. "Stanley kept records, Tommy. Documentation of everything they asked him to do, every visit they made, every conversation they had. He was protecting himself, but he was also protecting the truth." My phone buzzed with a text message. The sender was listed as Property Management Services, but the message made my hands shake. "Mr. Kowalski, we understand you're handling your grandfather's estate. We'd like to discuss a generous offer for his property. Very generous. Please call at your earliest convenience." Harold saw my expression and didn't need to ask what I'd received. "It's starting, Tommy. They tried the carrot with Stanley, and when that didn't work, they started preparing the stick. Now they're coming after you, and they're using your own family to do it." The waitress approached again, this time with a concerned expression. "Everything all right over here, Harold? You boys look like you've seen a ghost." "Just family talk, Dolores," Harold said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "Nothing that can't wait for another day." But as Dolores walked away, Harold's expression told a different story. This was family talk, but it was the kind that could get people killed if they asked too many questions or refused too many generous offers. And somewhere in those Pennsylvania woods, buried beneath decades of fallen leaves and government secrets, Stanley's bunker waited with whatever truth had been important enough for a dying man to protect with his final breath. I drove back to Stanley's house through gathering storm clouds, Harold's warnings echoing in my mind like thunder that hadn't yet reached the ground. The generous offer text had been followed by 2 more messages, each one escalating in urgency and specificity. Someone wanted Stanley's property badly enough to track down my personal phone number within hours of our meeting at the diner. The house felt different when I unlocked the front door, charged with the same electric tension that preceded Pennsylvania thunderstorms. Every shadow seemed deeper, every creak of old floorboards carried potential menace. I was being paranoid, I told myself, but paranoia felt like a reasonable response when government agencies and family members were converging on secrets that had been buried for 60 years. I retrieved the classified documents from Stanley's safe and spread them across his kitchen table, studying the architectural drawings with new understanding. The bunker wasn't just a Cold War relic, it was a sophisticated installation that had been designed to remain functional for decades. The electrical systems included backup generators and battery arrays that could power the facility independently. The ventilation system incorporated filtration technology that seemed advanced even by current standards. Most intriguingly, the communications equipment listed in the inventory included radio systems capable of reaching frequencies I didn't recognize. But it was the supply manifests that told the real story. The bunker had been stocked not just for nuclear survival, but for extended intelligence operations. The equipment list included document reproduction capabilities, encrypted communication devices, and what appeared to be surveillance technology. Stanley hadn't just built a family shelter, he'd built a command post. My phone rang, startling me from my analysis. The caller ID showed my father's number. "Tommy, where are you? Michael's been trying to reach you all afternoon." "I'm at Stanley's house going through his papers." I kept my voice neutral, though every instinct warned me to be careful about what I revealed. "Why? What does Michael need?" "He's found a buyer for the property, someone willing to pay significantly above market value, but they want to close quickly. Michael thinks we should seriously consider it. The timing was too convenient, the buyer too eager." "Who's the buyer?" "Some kind of development company. Michael has the details, but apparently they specialize in historical preservation projects." My father's pause suggested he found the explanation as unconvincing as I did. "The thing is, Tommy, they're only interested if we can guarantee clear title to the entire property, including any structures or improvements Stanley might have built over the years. What kind of structures? Another pause. That's what Michael wants to discuss with you. He says there might be more to Stanley's property than we realized. Old foundations, maybe storage buildings. The buyer wants to make sure there aren't any surprises during the development process. I stared at the architectural drawings spread across Stanley's kitchen table, understanding finally dawning. My family wasn't just greedy, they were being used. Someone had fed them enough information to make them eager accomplices in accessing Stanley's bunker, probably without revealing the true nature of what they were helping to acquire. Dad, how long has Michael been researching Stanley's property? Oh, months now. Ever since Stanley's first heart attack last winter. Michael thought we should be prepared, in case. His voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. They'd been planning Stanley's estate disposition while he was still alive, still fighting for his health and his independence. I need to think about this, I said. It's a big decision. Of course. But Tommy, this buyer won't wait forever. Michael says they have other properties they're considering if we can't move quickly. After ending the call, I sat in Stanley's kitchen as rain began pattering against the windows, trying to understand the scope of what was unfolding. The government wanted Stanley's bunker secured or destroyed. A mysterious development company wanted to buy the property with unusual urgency. My family was eager to sell to the highest bidder. And somewhere in the middle of this convergence, I held the only map to whatever truth Stanley had died protecting. The rain intensified, drumming against the roof with increasing urgency. I decided to risk one more exploration of the house before darkness fell, looking for anything else Stanley might have hidden. In the basement workshop, I examined the pegboard wall where the missing tools had hung, noting the precise outlines Stanley had drawn around each implement. The missing items formed a pattern: heavy construction tools, excavation equipment, items needed for underground work. But behind the pegboard, barely visible unless you knew where to look, I found something Stanley had hidden in plain sight. A section of the basement wall that looked like painted cinder block was actually a carefully crafted facade. When I pressed against it, it moved slightly, revealing hinges so well concealed they were invisible from a distance of more than a few inches. The hidden panel opened to reveal a narrow storage space containing items that made my pulse race: military surplus equipment that looked recently maintained, night vision goggles, a two-way radio system with frequencies that matched those listed in the bunker specifications, and most significantly, a detailed journal in Stanley's handwriting that documented every contact he'd had with government agents over the past 3 years. The journal entries painted a picture of escalating pressure and increasingly sophisticated psychological manipulation. The agents had started with friendly visits, ostensibly checking on Stanley's health and offering assistance with property maintenance. But as Stanley had continued refusing their suggestions, the visits had become more frequent and more pointed. The final entry, dated just 2 weeks before Stanley's death, was written in shaky handwriting that betrayed his deteriorating health. They know about Tommy, mentioned him by name, said they hoped the family could reach an understanding that Stanley might be too proud to accept. Asked about his job, his apartment, his routine, making it clear they can reach anyone, anywhere, time running out. Must trust T with everything before they find another way to get what they want. I closed the journal with hands that trembled slightly. Stanley hadn't just been protecting a Cold War secret. He'd been protecting me from people who were willing to use family pressure and potentially more direct methods to achieve their objectives. Thunder crashed outside, and the lights flickered momentarily. In that brief darkness, I made my decision. Tomorrow, I would follow Stanley's map into those woods and find whatever he'd built there. But tonight, I would prepare for the possibility that I might not be making that journey alone. The documents went back into their fireproof safe, but not before I photographed every page with my phone and uploaded them to a secure cloud storage account. The journal went into a manila envelope that I addressed to Harold, with instructions to open it only if something happened to me. The map remained in my pocket, but I created a detailed copy that I hid in a different location. If Stanley had taught me anything during those childhood summers, it was the value of preparation and the importance of having backup plans. He'd survived Korea by thinking 3 steps ahead of his enemies and never trusting that tomorrow would resemble today. As I locked Stanley's house and drove back to Reading through the thunderstorm, I carried with me the weight of 60 years' worth of secrets and the growing certainty that some of those secrets were about to demand a reckoning that had been delayed too long. The storm was just beginning. The thunderstorm had passed by dawn, leaving the Pennsylvania woods washed clean and smelling of damp earth and dying leaves. I stood at the edge of Stanley's property at 6 a.m., studying the hand-drawn map one final time before venturing into terrain that had remained unchanged since my childhood explorations. The lightning-scarred oak was exactly where Stanley had indicated, its blackened trunk rising like a monument to nature's violence 47 paces from the old stone fence that marked the original property boundary. I'd brought everything Harold's journal had suggested: a powerful flashlight, basic tools, the two-way radio from Stanley's hidden cache, and most importantly, the knowledge that I wasn't just searching for a Cold War relic anymore. I was looking for evidence of an active government program that had killed my grandfather to protect its secrets. The words felt strange, even thinking them, but Harold's final revelation the night before had shattered any remaining illusions about Stanley's natural death. The heart attack that had claimed him hadn't been the inevitable result of age and poor health. It had been chemically induced by agents who'd grown tired of his refusal to cooperate. Harold had suspected, but couldn't prove it until he'd found Stanley's final medical records, which showed unusual chemical traces that the hospital had dismissed as medication interactions. My grandfather had been murdered for protecting whatever lay buried in these woods. 47 paces northeast from the scarred oak brought me to a depression in the forest floor that looked natural unless you understood what to look for. The architectural drawings had shown the bunker entrance disguised as a natural hillside, with the actual doorway concealed beneath what appeared to be fallen logs and accumulated debris from decades of forest growth. But when I began clearing away the carefully arranged camouflage, what I found exceeded every expectation Stanley's documents had prepared me for. The entrance wasn't just hidden, it was actively maintained. The fallen logs were actually concrete forms that had been painted and textured to blend with genuine deadfall. The metal door beneath was clean, oiled, and equipped with an electronic lock that hummed with current from an obviously functional power source. This wasn't a decommissioned Cold War installation. This was an active facility that someone had been maintaining for 60 years. I tried the combination Harold had whispered to me during our final phone conversation, the date of Stanley's discharge from the Army, and the lock disengaged with a soft electronic chirp. The door opened on silent hinges, revealing a staircase that descended into LED-illuminated depths that definitely hadn't existed during the Eisenhower administration. The first chamber I entered took my breath away. The space was larger than Stanley's entire house, with concrete walls that curved gracefully to form a barrel-vaulted ceiling. But more shocking than the size was the condition. Everything was pristine, modern, and obviously in active use. Computer terminals lined one wall, their screens showing data streams I didn't recognize. Communication equipment that looked like it belonged in a Pentagon command center filled another section, and covering every available wall space were maps, photographs, and documents that made me understand the true scope of what Stanley had been protecting. This wasn't just a bunker. It was an intelligence archive. The documents covering the walls traced the evolution of government programs from the Family Shelter Initiative through decades of successors with names like Operation Deeproot, Project Homestead, and finally something called the Civilian Asset Protection Program. Photographs showed similar installations across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia, each one built by carefully selected citizens who'd been recruited for their skills, their isolation, and their absolute discretion. But Stanley's installation was different from the others, according to the documentation I found. While most bunkers had been designed purely for survival, Stanley's had been equipped as a monitoring station, capable of intercepting and recording communications across a wide spectrum of frequencies. For 60 years, this facility had been collecting intelligence on everything from local law enforcement communications to federal agency radio traffic, and Stanley had been recording it all. The computer terminals revealed terabytes of data spanning decades of surveillance activities. Phone conversations between government officials discussing programs that officially didn't exist. Recorded meetings where agents planned the natural deaths of citizens who'd become inconvenient. Video footage of operations that had been classified beyond any legal authority. Stanley hadn't just been protecting his bunker from government seizure. He'd been protecting evidence that could bring down an entire shadow network of illegal surveillance and assassination programs. That's when I heard the footsteps on the metal stairs behind me. Impressive, isn't it? The voice was calm, professional, with the kind of authority that expected immediate compliance. Stanley always was our most thorough asset. I turned to find a man in his 60s descending the stairs, wearing the kind of conservative suit that screamed federal agent. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his shoes polished to mirror brightness, and his smile carried the cold efficiency of someone who'd spent decades eliminating problems for powerful people. "Colonel Morrison, I presume," I said, surprised by how steady my own voice sounded. "Retired Colonel Morrison," he corrected, "though certain obligations never really end, do they? Just as certain family legacies never really die." His eyes swept the chamber with practiced familiarity. Stanley built something remarkable here, far beyond what the original program required. We've been trying to reclaim it for years. "So you killed him?" Morrison's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. Stanley died of natural causes brought on by a lifetime of poor health choices. The medical examiner's report is quite clear on that point. "Chemically induced heart attack," I said, remembering Harold's words. "Untraceable, undetectable, and convenient for people who needed Stanley to disappear quietly." For the first time, Morrison's professional composure cracked slightly. "You've been talking to Harold, another stubborn old man who doesn't understand that some secrets are too dangerous for civilian custody." He gestured toward the computer terminals. "This facility contains 60 years of classified intelligence gathered under legal authority that predates most current oversight structures. It was never meant to be controlled by private citizens." "Legal authority?" I laughed, though there was no humor in it. "Nothing about this program has been legal since the Cold War ended. Stanley documented everything, Colonel. Every illegal surveillance operation, every assassination disguised as natural death, every citizen you've manipulated or murdered to protect your shadow network." Morrison's hand moved toward his jacket, but stopped when I pulled out my phone and showed him the screen. "Live stream," I said. "Everything we're saying is being broadcast to multiple secure servers. If anything happens to me, it automatically releases every document Stanley collected over the past 60 years. Names, dates, operations, body counts, all of it." The lie came easily, though my phone was actually just displaying my home screen. But Morrison's reaction told me I'd guessed correctly about the scope of what Stanley had discovered and preserved. "You don't understand what you're threatening," Morrison said, his voice carrying the first hints of genuine emotion. "These programs exist to protect national security. The people we've eliminated were threats to operations that keep this country safe from enemies you can't imagine. People like Stanley, a 78-year-old machinist whose only crime was refusing to let you steal the evidence of your crimes?" Morrison was quiet for a long moment, studying me with the calculating gaze of a predator evaluating prey. When he spoke again, his voice had regained its professional calm. "What do you want?" The question hung in the air between us like smoke from a discharged weapon. Morrison was negotiating now, which meant he believed I had something valuable enough to trade for my life. "I want the truth," I said. "All of it, starting with how many people you've killed to protect this program." Morrison smiled, and for the first time since he'd appeared, the expression reached his eyes. "More than you can imagine, son. Far more than you can imagine." Morrison's admission hung in the air like cordite after gunfire, confirming what I'd suspected but hadn't wanted to believe. The scope of the murders, the systematic elimination of anyone who threatened their shadow network, the decades of blood spilled to protect secrets that should never have existed in the first place. But his confidence worried me more than his confession. A man who just admitted to multiple murders shouldn't look so relaxed unless he had a plan for dealing with witnesses. "You're wondering why I'm being so forthcoming," Morrison said, settling against one of the computer terminals with casual familiarity. "It's because this conversation doesn't leave this bunker. Neither do you." The electronic lock on the entrance above us engaged with a soft chirp, followed by the hum of additional systems activating. The LED lighting shifted to emergency red, and I heard the distant sound of ventilation fans spinning down to silence. "Sealed environment," Morrison explained conversationally. "Stanley designed it to be completely self-contained during nuclear emergencies. Air recycling, independent power, the works. Very effective for containing other kinds of emergencies as well." My phone showed no signal bars. Whatever they'd activated was jamming all outside communications. The live stream bluff that had given me momentary leverage was now completely useless. "The beauty of Stanley's design," Morrison continued, "is that it can simulate any number of natural disasters, structural collapse, electrical fire, Carbon monoxide leak. By the time rescue crews breach the sealed entrance, they'll find tragic evidence of an accident that claimed the life of Stanley's grandson while he was exploring his grandfather's Cold War bunker. But Morrison had made a critical error in his confidence. He'd focused so intently on sealing me inside the bunker that he'd forgotten about the preparations Stanley had taught me to make during those childhood summers. Always have a backup plan. Always assume the worst-case scenario. Always be ready to fight for your life. The two-way radio I'd taken from Stanley's hidden cache wasn't connected to the bunker's communication systems. It operated on frequencies that predated the facility's jamming capabilities. And Harold wasn't the only person who'd been expecting to hear from me. "Problem is," I said, pulling the radio from my jacket, "Stanley planned for people like you." I keyed the transmit button twice, sending a prearranged signal that Harold would recognize. Within 30 seconds, the bunker's intercom system crackled to life with Harold's voice, broadcasting from the surface using equipment Stanley had positioned for exactly this contingency. "Tommy, you in there, son?" Morrison's professional composure cracked completely. "That's impossible. We scanned for all communication devices." "Stanley was a machinist, not an idiot," I said. "He spent 60 years preparing for the day you'd try to eliminate the evidence, including the evidence that walks on two legs." The intercom crackled again, this time with a different voice, deeper, more official. "Colonel Morrison, this is Agent Sarah Chen, FBI Counterintelligence Division. We have the bunker surrounded and a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of murder, conspiracy, and violation of federal surveillance statutes." Morrison's face went white. "That's not possible. My people would have—" "Your people have been under surveillance for 18 months, Agent Chen's voice cut through his protests. "Ever since a retired Army Corps engineer named Harold Kowalski contacted our office with evidence of illegal assassination programs targeting American citizens. The pieces clicked into place with startling clarity. Harold's nervousness at the diner hadn't been fear of Morrison's people. It had been the tension of a man executing a complex plan that had been months in the making. Stanley's death hadn't been the end of his resistance to Morrison's program. It had been the beginning of its complete exposure. "Stanley knew they were going to kill him," I said, understanding flooding through me like ice water. "He spent his final months documenting everything, passing information to Harold, setting up the evidence trail that would bring them down after his death." Morrison's hand moved toward his jacket again, but the bunker's entrance door cycled open above us with a pneumatic hiss. Combat boots thundered down the metal stairs as FBI tactical agents flooded the chamber, their weapons trained on Morrison with professional precision. "Hands visible, Colonel," Agent Chen commanded as she descended behind the tactical team. She was a small Asian woman whose quiet authority filled the bunker like electricity before a storm. "You're under arrest for the murders of Stanley Kowalski, Margaret Webb, David Chen, no relation, and approximately 17 other American citizens whose only crime was possessing information your program deemed inconvenient." Morrison raised his hands slowly, but his eyes never left mine. "You have no idea what you've destroyed," he said. "The programs I ran protected this country from threats that would make your grandfather's Korean War nightmares look like children's games." "Maybe," I said. "But Stanley fought in Korea to protect American freedoms, not to help shadow agencies murder American citizens. I think he'd approve of how this turned out." As the FBI agents secured Morrison and began documenting the bunker's contents, Agent Chen approached me with a mixture of professional interest and personal concern. "Mr. Kowalski, your grandfather was a remarkable man. The intelligence he provided over his final months will allow us to shut down illegal programs that have operated outside constitutional oversight for decades." She gestured toward the computer terminals. "This facility contains evidence of crimes spanning 3 administrations. Prosecutions will continue for years." "What about my family?" I asked. "They were involved, but I don't think they understood what they were really helping with." Chen's expression softened slightly. "Your cousin Michael and Aunt Patricia were cooperative witnesses once they understood the true nature of Morrison's program. They'll face charges for obstruction and conspiracy, but their sentences will reflect their level of actual knowledge and cooperation." As we emerged from the bunker into the Pennsylvania afternoon, I found Harold waiting beside an FBI mobile command vehicle, his weathered face showing relief mixed with exhaustion. He embraced me with the fierce intensity of a man who'd spent months fearing he might lose another family member to Morrison's shadow network. Stanley would be proud, Harold said. Proud and probably a little surprised that his plan worked as well as it did. His plan? Harold smiled. Stanley spent his last year turning himself into the perfect bait, made himself so valuable and so dangerous that Morrison would have to come for him personally. And when Morrison did, Stanley made sure all the evidence would be waiting in exactly the right hands. I looked back at the bunker entrance, now swarming with federal agents and forensic specialists who would spend months cataloging 60 years of accumulated evidence. Stanley had built more than a Cold War shelter in those woods. He'd built a trap that had taken 6 decades to spring. But it had worked perfectly. 6 months after Morrison's arrest, I found myself standing in Stanley's kitchen again. But this time the house felt alive in ways it hadn't since Rose's death 26 years earlier. The morning sunlight streaming through windows that had been professionally cleaned revealed a space transformed by purpose rather than grief. FBI forensic teams had spent 3 months cataloging every document Stanley had preserved, but they'd been careful to restore the house to its original condition when their work was complete. The kitchen table where I'd first spread out the classified documents now held architectural plans of a different sort. Blueprints for converting Stanley's property into the Stanley and Rose Kowalski Memorial Center for Government Accountability. The FBI had recommended the project after realizing that Stanley's archive contained too much historically significant material to remain buried in federal evidence lockers. "Tommy," Harold's voice called from the basement workshop. At 74, he moved more carefully than he had 6 months ago, but his energy had returned with the lifting of secrets he'd carried too long. "Come take a look at this." I found him standing before the pegboard wall where Stanley's tools had hung in perfect order, but now the outlines contained new implements, tools donated by other families whose loved ones had been victims of Morrison's program. Each tool carried a small brass nameplate identifying its previous owner and the circumstances of their death. "FBI contacted me yesterday," Harold said, running his fingers along the handle of a hammer that had belonged to David Chen, Morrison's last victim before Stanley. "They've identified 43 people killed by the program over 30 years, 43 families who thought their loved ones died of natural causes." The number hit me like cold water. Morrison hadn't been exaggerating when he'd claimed more victims than I could imagine. Stanley's resistance hadn't just been about protecting his own bunker, it had been about stopping a systematic murder program that had claimed dozens of American lives. "What's going to happen to them?" I asked. "To Morrison's people?" "Trials start next month," Harold said. "Morrison himself is cooperating now, providing names and operational details in exchange for life without parole instead of the death penalty. Seems he's more afraid of his former colleagues than he is of federal prison." The irony wasn't lost on me. Morrison, who'd spent decades eliminating inconvenient witnesses, was now desperately seeking protection from the same shadow network he'd served so loyally. My phone buzzed with a text from Agent Chen. "Memorial dedication ceremony approved for next month. Stanley would be proud of what you've built." The Stanley and Rose Kowalski Memorial Center had become more than just a repository for government accountability archives. Working with Harold and the FBI, I'd developed it into an educational facility where visitors could learn about the importance of civilian oversight of intelligence programs and the courage required to resist government overreach. The bunker itself had been preserved exactly as Stanley had left it, with guided tours led by former intelligence officers who'd agreed to testify about illegal surveillance programs. The computer terminals that had once collected evidence of government crimes now displayed educational materials about constitutional rights and the history of intelligence oversight. But the most meaningful transformation had occurred in Stanley's house itself. The living room where my family had gathered to divide his possessions now served as a meeting space for families of Morrison's victims. The kitchen where Patricia had calculated real estate values now hosted support groups for people struggling to understand how their government had betrayed their trust. Rose's memory lived in the center as well. Her recipe collection had been preserved and published as a cookbook, with proceeds supporting legal aid for families seeking justice for government misconduct. Her garden had been restored and expanded, providing a peaceful space for reflection and remembrance. "Your cousin Michael stopped by yesterday," Harold said as we climbed the basement stairs. "Wanted to see what you'd done with the place." Michael's legal troubles had been resolved with a plea agreement that reflected his limited knowledge of Morrison's true activities. He'd received probation and community service, but the real punishment had been the destruction of his reputation in Philadelphia's real estate community. The BMW had been repossessed, the expensive suits sold, and the calculating arrogance replaced by genuine remorse. What did he think? Harold smiled. Said it was the first time the house felt like home since Rose died. Said Stanley would have liked seeing it filled with people who understood what he'd been fighting for. That afternoon, I walked through the woods behind Stanley's house, following the path to the bunker that had become a pilgrimage route for families seeking to understand their loved ones' deaths. The trail was marked now with memorial stones identifying each of Morrison's victims, creating a permanent reminder of the cost of unchecked government power. At the bunker entrance, I found Mrs. Chen, David's widow, sitting on the bench we'd installed for visitors who needed time to process what they'd learned. She was reading from a folder of documents the FBI had declassified, learning for the first time about her husband's final months and the courage he'd shown in gathering evidence against Morrison's program. He was braver than I knew, she said when I approached. I thought he'd become paranoid in his final year, constantly worried about government surveillance, always looking over his shoulder. I never imagined he was actually gathering evidence that would help bring down the people who killed him. David Chen had been a NASA engineer who discovered that Morrison's program was using space-based surveillance assets to monitor domestic targets without warrants. Like Stanley, he'd tried to resist quietly, and like Stanley, he'd been eliminated when resistance became inconvenient. Stanley said something to Harold before he died, I told her. He said the only way to honor the dead was to make sure their deaths accomplished something meaningful. I think David would be proud of what his evidence helped expose. Mrs. Chen nodded, tears running down her cheeks as she clutched the folder. The FBI agent said there might be civil lawsuits against the program administrators, financial compensation for the families. Money won't bring them back, I said, but it might help prevent it from happening again. As evening approached, I made my way back to Stanley's house, where Harold was preparing dinner using one of Rose's recipes. The kitchen smelled like kielbasa and sauerkraut, the same combination that had greeted me during childhood visits when the world seemed simpler and government agents were just characters in spy movies. "Think Stanley's watching all this?" Harold asked as we sat down to eat. "I hope so," I said. "I hope he knows that his trap worked better than he ever imagined. Morrison's program is finished, the archives are public, and the families have answers they've been seeking for decades." Harold raised his beer bottle in a toast. "To Stanley Kowalski, machinist, soldier, patriot, and the most patient man who ever lived." Outside, the Pennsylvania woods settled into evening quiet, no longer hiding deadly secrets, but serving as a memorial to ordinary Americans who'd found extraordinary courage when their government demanded their silence. Stanley's war was finally over, and this time, the good guys had won. 2 years after Morrison's conviction, I stood in the restored basement workshop on a crisp October morning, watching my 8-year-old niece Emma carefully measure a piece of wood under Harold's patient guidance. She was building a birdhouse for the memorial garden, her small hands gripping Stanley's old measuring tape with the same precision that had characterized her great-great-grandfather's approach to every project. "Measure twice, cut once," Harold reminded her, his voice carrying the wisdom of 8 decades spent learning that some mistakes couldn't be undone. That's what Stanley always said, and that's what kept him alive in Korea and everything that came after. Emma nodded solemnly, understanding on some instinctive level that the tools she was using carried more weight than their physical mass. The workshop had become a teaching space where children learned traditional craftsmanship while absorbing lessons about integrity, courage, and the importance of standing up to authority when authority went wrong. The Stanley and Rose Kowalski Memorial Center had grown beyond anything I'd imagined during those first dark months after the bunker's discovery. What had started as a simple archive had evolved into a national resource for families seeking information about government misconduct, a training center for intelligence oversight committees, and most importantly, a living reminder that ordinary citizens possess the power to hold their government accountable. The morning mail brought correspondence that would have seemed impossible 2 years ago. A letter from a congressional oversight committee requesting access to Stanley's archives for an investigation into current surveillance programs. A thank you note from a high school student whose history project on the center had won a national competition, and a check from the Justice Department's Victim Compensation Fund that would ensure the center's operations for another decade. But the letter that mattered most came from Mrs. Chen, David's widow, who had remarried and found happiness again, while never forgetting the husband whose courage had helped expose Morrison's crimes. Tommy, her letter read, I wanted you to know that David's youngest granddaughter is starting college this fall, studying constitutional law. She says she wants to specialize in intelligence oversight, to make sure programs like Morrison's can never operate in secret again. David would be so proud to know his death contributed to training the next generation of guardians. The ripple effects continued expanding in ways that would have amazed Stanley. Morrison's conviction had triggered congressional hearings that led to new oversight legislation, mandatory reporting requirements for intelligence programs, and criminal penalties for agents who participated in assassination programs. 3 other shadow networks had been exposed and dismantled using investigative techniques pioneered during the Stanley Kowalski case. My family had changed as well. Michael had used his community service hours to volunteer at the Memorial Center, gradually transforming from someone who viewed everything through financial calculations into someone who understood that some values couldn't be measured in dollars. Patricia had established a scholarship fund for children whose parents had been victims of government misconduct, channeling her organizational skills toward causes that honored rather than exploited tragedy. Even my father had found peace with Stanley's memory. The resentment he'd carried for decades, resentment born from feeling excluded from Stanley's inner life, had dissolved when he understood that Stanley's secrecy had been protection, not rejection. Robert now served on the center's board of directors, applying his business experience to ensuring sustainable operations. Emma, you ready to install that birdhouse? I asked, watching her put the finishing touches on her project. Uncle Tommy, why did great-great-grandpa Stanley build the secret place? She asked with the directness that only children possess. I considered how to explain complex truths to an 8-year-old mind. Because sometimes good people have to keep dangerous secrets to protect other good people. Stanley spent his whole life making sure the right people learned those secrets at the right time. Like you did? Like I got to help with, I corrected. Stanley did all the hard work. I just followed the map he left me. As we walked through the memorial garden to install Emma's birdhouse, I reflected on how profoundly my understanding of courage had evolved. I'd once thought courage meant dramatic confrontations and heroic gestures, but Stanley had taught me that true courage often looked like quiet persistence, patient preparation, and the willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for principles that would outlive any individual life. The garden itself had become a testament to that quiet courage. 43 memorial stones marked the graves of Morrison's victims, but they were surrounded by flowering plants that Rose had loved, creating beauty from tragedy and hope from despair. Visitors often commented that the garden felt peaceful rather than sorrowful, as if the dead were finally at rest, knowing their sacrifices had meaning. Harold's health had stabilized remarkably since Morrison's arrest, as if releasing the burden of 60 years of secrets had restored his vitality. At 76, he remained the center's most effective tour guide, sharing stories about Stanley and Rose that kept their memory alive while explaining the historical context that made their resistance so significant. You know what Stanley would say if he could see all this? Harold asked as we watched Emma carefully position her birdhouse on a post near Rose's restored herb garden. What? He'd say it proves what he always believed, that ordinary people doing ordinary things with extraordinary integrity can change the world. Harold's eyes reflected the satisfaction of a man who'd lived long enough to see justice triumph over cynicism. And he'd probably complain that we're making too big a fuss about something he considered simple duty. That evening, as I'd locked up the Memorial Center and prepared to return to my apartment in Reading, I paused in Stanley's restored kitchen. The crossword puzzle book still sat on the table, open to the page Stanley had been working on during his final day at home. I'd left it exactly as he'd positioned it, a reminder that even the most significant lives are built from moments of ordinary human activity. The puzzle was nearly complete with only one word remaining, a 7-letter answer to the clue, legacy left by those who resist tyranny. Stanley had penciled in the letters FREEDOM, but had erased the final letter, leaving the answer tantalizingly incomplete. I picked up Stanley's worn pencil and filled in the missing M, completing his final puzzle and his final lesson. Freedom wasn't something that could be won once and preserved forever. It required constant vigilance, continuous resistance, and the willingness of each generation to complete the work their predecessors had begun. Outside, the Pennsylvania woods settled into evening quiet. their shadows no longer hiding deadly secrets but sheltering the kind of peace that can only exist when truth finally triumphs over deception. Stanley's bunker remained open to visitors, its computers now displaying educational materials about the eternal struggle between government power and individual liberty. In my pocket, I still carried the original map Stanley had drawn, though I'd long since memorized every detail. It had led me to more than just a hidden bunker. It had led me to an understanding of what it meant to be worthy of the freedoms others had died to protect. Stanley Kowalski had spent 78 years learning how to leave a legacy that would outlive any individual life. His final gift hadn't been property or possessions, but the knowledge that ordinary citizens possessed extraordinary power when they chose to use it. The map had led me home. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Stanley Kowalski's final gift. If you enjoyed this story of courage, resistance, and the ultimate triumph of truth over tyranny, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts about the importance of government accountability in the comments below. To listen to the next story of ordinary people achieving extraordinary justice, click on the playlist now showing on your screen.